Hey TechKnowStuds! When data reaches the end of its life cycle, that is, it's ready to be retired, then there are certain ways that we may need to handle that data depending on what laws and regulations and the company needs are. So in this lesson, let's go over data retention and retirement. When data reaches the end of its life cycle, it's time to retire it. And maybe we need to do some sort of archiving or destroying of this data. So we need to do that in a proper way. Data has that balance between being an asset and a liability. And when it's no longer an asset, then it's strictly a liability. And what we need to do is need to properly dispose of it. Of course, much of how we dispose of something is going to depend on the laws and regulations that you have to comply with. So in this scenario, let's say that we have several users that are no longer customers. We have personally identifiable information. At this point, what we need to do is we need to make sure they're no longer in our systems. It would be devastating if they have left us as a customer, and then we have to notify them later on that we lost their data and that we have to make it right with these users that are really no longer using our services. But if only it were that simple. Because data resides in a lot of different places. For instance, we may have a database where that information is at, and perhaps we have a backup copy of that as well. And maybe we have another site that has that same information in case we need to fail over to that site with a backup copy there. So what we need to do is think about all of the different locations that this data could exist. Archives are kind of similar to backups, but they serve a little different purpose. A backup is when we just take a data set and we create a copy of it. And we keep a backup just in case something goes awry and we need to do a restore of that. Archive is more of like when we're done with data and we don't need it anymore, but we may need to access it in a rare occasion. And so we are going to put it in a location that's not quite as accessible. Maybe it's a cheaper storage, but we don't have a lot of great access to it. And so we move it to that cheaper storage that we are probably maybe not going to use this data again, but maybe potentially use that data again. And so then we put it into an archive. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say we have a database here and it has a million records to it. And what we want to do is we want to delete 100,000 of those records. And so we're going to kind of clean things up. But before we delete these 100,000 records, what we're going to do is we're going to move a copy of them into archive. So we have these old records that are in archive just in case we need them again. Then what we'll do is remove them from our system. So now we only have 900,000, which is great because now we've increased the performance of this database system. We're only backing up 900,000 records. And so now we have some of the advantages of keeping those records off of our system, but we still have an archive copy of it in case we need to access them again. Now, just because you delete the data off of these different sources doesn't mean that the data still doesn't exist on them. And what I mean by that is the way that a lot of storage works is it creates a copy of the file into something called clusters. And then it references these clusters for each of the files. And so you could delete the file, and what it does is it just deletes the reference, but the data still exists until it gets written over. So what we need to make sure is that the data actually gets deleted and completely removed. We call it sanitization. And we either do it by doing wipes, special wipes on the system, writing ones and zeros multiple times, or we somehow physically do a destruction of the drives that it's on. So we do something like shred them or send it to somebody who will properly dispose of those drives. Now, before we just start deleting certain data, we do need to keep in mind that some data we have to retain for a certain period of time. For instance, financial records, we have to retain for a certain period of time. And so what that looks like is we may need to create an archive just in case we get audited or some sort of the IRS comes in and wants to take a look at our records. Then what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have some sort of data retention for certain data. So another example might be is we are a lot of times when we don't have users, we are supposed to remove them from the system. But one of the exceptions to that is like schools have to maintain certain records for students for 10 years. So that's an example where they have a retention requirement. Ultimately, what we're going to have to do is do some sort of data inventory on what type of data we have, and then determine for each of those types of data how we're going to destroy that information or retain that information, or how to manage that data when it becomes end of life.